welcome to another episode of the Everyday Defender podcast. I'm your host, Chris Goosen, and I'm joined as always by this man right here. Koos, how are you, my friend?
Hey Chris, how you doing? I'm doing great.
Doing
Just
very
back
well,
from a
very well.
holiday, so I'm fully recharged and relaxed, and a little bit of a tan on me as well. So relaxing start of new.
Greece will do that to you, I think. If you spend some time in Greece, that you will come back energized. You do
You
very
cannot
much look
evade the
energized.
sun. You cannot evade the sun. I actually experienced an earthquake as well when I was there. It was my first time actually. It was a quite a weird experience. Middle of the night, my bed and the whole house was shaking a little bit. Luckily,
Wow,
nobody got hurt and there was no damage on the island, but it was a weird experience.
that's so funny. We had an earthquake here, like southwestern Sydney, which is where I am. Well, I'm on the outskirts. We had a 3.5 magnitude earthquake like 2 days ago.
Oh,
I didn't even notice it, but my cat went crazy. So it was really
oh,
weird. Anyway, I've been thinking about you over the last couple of weeks because I've been digging into and playing with Sentinel and log ingestion with Logstash. So I've been
okay.
kind of instead of using a syslog, rsyslog, or something like that, and
Yeah,
then having the agent push it. I've been messing around with Logstash on Linux, and then have Logstash take the logs and ingest them. And
yeah,
I love that. The idea of that, and I think being able to do those transforms and stuff before you
yeah,
ingest,
yeah.
such powerful thing. So, but luckily, I haven't had to ping you yet because I've been able to get it all done myself without going, "Cause how do I do this thing?" So, but
Yeah, it's
it's been a lot of
funny
fun.
when you Google something Sentinel and Logstash related, my blogs come up quite high in the Google rankings. So that's funny. I'm a
I
big
really
fan as
like
well.
Logstash. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, especially the multi-destination bit is also great. Something you
Yeah.
cannot do easily with the Microsoft out-of-the-box solutions. Yeah. Well,
No,
glad that
very
you like
cool.
it.
Yeah, it's been fun. So more on this at some point. At the moment, I'm still just playing and labbing, but at some point, maybe we'll have an episode on that.
Yeah.
But in today's episode, another month, another episode, we have. So I've got 5 things that you can do to harden your M365 tenant. Things that you should probably be doing to harden your M365 tenant. And Koos, tell me about Sentinel summoning rules or summary rules. We're gonna
Yes.
trip that one up a few times today, aren't we?
Yeah, summary rules. It's a relatively new feature in Sentinel, still in preview. Yeah, so I spoke about some log strategy details in episode 4 back in March, and I touched on auxiliary logs, which were still in preview back then. They're now general available, and I touched on why you would probably also want to look into Azure Data Explorer back then, because the usefulness of logs in auxiliary and basic tables is a bit of, well, it was a little bit meh, to be honest. And I think with summary rules, Microsoft is taking a great step into the right direction of increasing the value of the logs in those tables. So if you're not moving away to Azure Data Explorer, or if you probably did, and you have probably reasons why it was easier to have all your logs in one place, you might want to look into summary rules, and probably make your life a little bit easier.
Man, that sounds exciting. Okay, well, we'll get into that after we talk about some tenant hardening. And the reason that I've kind of come and back behind the scenes of this podcast, this has been a topic that I've been wanting to talk about for 2 or 3 episodes now. And whenever we plan our episodes, oftentimes something else comes in, trumps the topics that we have, or for whatever reason we talk about other things. But I've been wanting to talk about this for a while because I think whenever I do assessments for customers and I look at their tenants, now very often I'm following guidance like CIS and the CIS benchmarks, but more often than not, find that a lot of these default configurations have never been changed, right? And I think one of the things about M365 is that your tenant by default is there to make you, and I'm using air quotes for those of you who are listening and not watching, to make you as productive as possible, right? So really optimize for productivity, but probably not optimal when it comes to security and secure posture, right? By default, a lot of the stuff is wide open, and you really want to go in there and sort of turn off or tweak some of these configurations. And oftentimes customers say, well, you know what, I'm not using SharePoint Online yet, so why should I bother configuring SharePoint Online? Well, it's a lot harder to fix things and configure things once you start putting data in it, right? Rather make sure that your tenant is hardened before you start lighting up services. And so I've got some tips here, and to be fair, there's a lot more than 5 things that you could probably be doing or should be doing. But really, in the interest of time and distilling this down into the episode, I wanted to bring up the 5 things that I think are probably the most important, right? And if you're an admin in a tenant, doesn't matter what size tenant, go and have a look at these configurations. Obviously, the more complex your environment, the longer it may take you to implement some of these things. But have a look anyway, and you might be surprised that some of these things are still configured, in the default settings. So the first thing,
Chris, these things are not enabled by default by Microsoft on also not on new tenants.
Correct. They are settings that you have to actually go in and tweak yourself. So if you think about, the default tenant configuration kind of leaves the door open, and what a lot of these settings are is to go and close that door a little bit, or at least put a lock on it, or what have you. So.
Okay, that's good.
Right. So the first one is disabling user app registration. Now, app registration, application consent, those things are currently very, very risky areas, right? We're seeing a lot more attacks happening on those vectors because folks are getting identity right. Like we're starting to harden identity to the point where it's a lot harder to attack the identity. So, well, what's the next best thing? Well, we start attacking apps and app registrations, right? So this first configuration, which is essentially allowing users within the tenant, any user within the tenant, to be able to register an app in Entra. By default, any user can register an app in Entra, right? And it's a really bad idea for many, many reasons. But really, if you think about unauthorized access to the tenant, to tenant resources, just due to misconfigurations, things like that. Just restrictions on data and what sort of data access you might be able to allow by doing this wrong or incorrectly. You really don't want users creating and registering apps in your tenant. And so in the Entra ID or in the Entra portal, it's a very simple setting, just called users can register applications. Set it to no. I'm going to, with all of these, include the steps to remediate in the show notes. Also, a lot more information about sort of why it's a good idea to remediate this. So don't take my word for it. You can read up on what's here, but also go and do some of your own research. And a lot of these things do actually line up very well with CIS. So again, if you do follow CIS benchmarks, you'll find that all of these things line up with CIS. But the takeaway from the first one is, you don't want users or any user to be registering apps in your environment. What you really want to be looking at is allowing specific roles to register apps, right? So if you do happen to have developers in the environment that are writing custom apps for your environment, you probably need a workflow of some sort that you can wrap around how applications get registered. Now, they probably should be working into a dev environment to begin with, right? So this shouldn't be happening in your prod environment anyway. But depending on your scenarios, it may not be as easy as saying no and turning everything off. You may want to have a workflow or some sort of request or consent form of some sort, so that there's some control over who can do this and who cannot. Because there may be legitimate reasons, that obviously are legitimate reasons why you might register apps into your tenant, but regular average users should not have the ability to do that, and you really want to go turn that off. Very, very closely aligned to that is user consent for applications, right? And I'm sure we've all sort of seen this in the wild, where you want to use some whiz-bang AI note-taking app, and immediately when you say sign up, the first thing it does is it pops up a window that says, such and such app wants to have access to your profile and would like to do, and then it lists a few things there that it wants to do, right? And you can click allow, and most users never read that. They just click allow on whatever pops up, because that's the only way you get to use the app. Well, that application now has full access to whatever you've given it permission to now. And typically in your environment, users are going to be able to grant permission to their profile and everything that they have access to within the environment. But you should not be allowing users to do that. So again, you don't want users to be able to consent at all to applications. And you should have a pretty tight policy, again, on who can consent for things that are tenant-wide. And you should have some sort of request process, right? Because if you think about it, there are going to be things where users are going to want to install some application that interacts with their M365 environment and their data, but you don't want them to just be able to do this with no sanction, right? You need a process whereby your cybersecurity team, your administrators can actually take a look and inspect the application and the permissions that the application has and is requesting before you just allow any app to be consented. Now, the problem with this as well is, like, once stuff's in there, it's really hard to go and comb through it and get rid of it as well, right? So for me, this one, I really don't like that this is on by default. So by default, anyone can consent to anything. This is one of the first things that I disable when doing a sort of a tenant hardening. And then you want to think about what sort of workflow can we create here for folks to do it. Now, there is actually built-in admin workflow scenarios within Entra where you can assign a group to a workflow, and then if the user needs to use whatever the app is, they can click request consent. That goes into a queue that the administrators and the tenant can then look at. They can investigate whether this is a good idea or a bad idea, whatever, and either decide to allow it or not. So definitely want to look at, and like I said, applications and application consent, these things are being actively targeted at the moment. I actually have a presentation that I've done before where I've created a fake app that looks to consent for a user, and it disguises itself as something that a user might want to use, but under the covers what it's doing is it's getting as much permission to the user's profile as it possibly can. And through Graph, we all know Graph is very, very deep and very granular as far as what sort of permissions you can request. And once you have that, you've got a real difficult challenge to get through all of these things and actually revoke all of those things. So better to just look at disabling them to begin with.
Yeah, attackers are using it in phishing campaigns and all kinds of attacks, indeed, to let user consent into certain stuff. And if you have not put the hardening in place, it might end up with more permissions than you want to. And even I see a lot of applications. I think that's also something that needs to change. It's not something you can really harden on upfront, but I see some third-party solutions wanting you to create applications and then consent to certain permissions, and there are way more permissions that they would likely to need, like full users read-write or full user read all Entra ID properties from all the users, for example. It can be abused, obviously, also quite quickly.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons for the very first recommendation, right, which is don't allow end users to create those apps, because as a vendor, the vendor comes to you with these requirements. As a user, you don't know what those things are. You just do it.
No.
Rather have that go through a process where you have a cyber team or administrators look at it and understand what these things are asking for before you actually just allow the app to be registered. So and
Microsoft
funny you mentioned that.
Firsthand, of course, with Midnight Blizzard. It was also an attack abusing apps in different tenant, which happened to have permissions in the production tenant and so forth. It's very difficult to find those things.
Yeah, that's right. And it's funny you mentioned the phishing scenario, because that's very common, and those phishing scenarios are not always on email, right? They can happen on Teams as well. And I actually have a tip for that as well coming up. As far as collaboration, and we all understand sort of guest access and allowing folks to be invited into the tenant for collaboration, which is a really, really good idea. But by default in the tenant, anyone can invite anyone to collaborate and have guest access. Really, I think that this needs to be locked down, and you want to be limiting it to limiting those invites to allowed domains only or trusted domains only. There's a domain allow list in Entra that you can use for this. You essentially add the domains that you want to allow guest access from, and those invites will only be allowed to go out to those domains. So it locks it down. Now, again, very easy to implement this, but obviously if you've been working and using M365 for 5 years or 10 years and you haven't done this, you might have a fairly large list of guest accounts already in your environment, right? And you want to, when you lock this down, you want to spend a little bit of time understanding who those collaboration partners are, you are the organizations that you're collaborating with, because it may be very simple and clear cut. It may not be so simple and clear cut depending on your environment. So again, it's one of those things that you want to build it up over time. You build up this list. It's not something you probably have full list on day one. I would say you need to implement this, and you want to provide a mechanism for users to request or provide feedback, right? If typically your sales organization may be reaching out and collaborating with lots of different vendors or different third parties, those types of things. So you as IT or as the security team may not know all of the folks that your organization is collaborating with, but it's a really, really good idea to lock this down and provide a mechanism for them to request, that be accessed. So again, something done in the Entra portal, and I have some steps in the show notes as to how you do this. The setting is called you allow invitations only to be sent to specified domains, and then there's a list of domains. And the fourth setting is very similar, but this one is actually in SharePoint and for SharePoint Online. And really what that does is external sharing again. You instead of allowing your users to just share with anyone outside, you want to lock that down to a list of trusted domains, right? So if you know that if I know that I'm collaborating with folks at Microsoft, you lock down Microsoft.com as an allowed list, allowed domain. You don't allow other domains to be the recipient of sharing requests and things like that. And this, it works under the very same similar principle, but this one you actually control and lock down in the SharePoint Admin Center. So and there's some settings in there for Teams, OneDrive as well, that probably worth taking a look at. I haven't listed those out here explicitly, but worth taking a look at how the OneDrive settings affect as well, because the OneDrive and the SharePoint settings are quite similar as far as allowing external access and things like that. A bunch of these sharing things are just on by default, and it really does give you that sort of risk of data leakage and folks just sharing stuff out in the wider world, where your compliance folks are probably, and your governance folks are probably not enjoying that. So so it's managed external sharing in SharePoint. And then the last one that I kind of wanted to talk about is in Teams. And again, there's so many things in Teams that are just on by default, but you can similarly allow collaboration only with allowed domains and stuff like that within Teams. But this one specifically is about disabling communication with unmanaged Teams users. And the concept of unmanaged is, free Teams accounts. Those are accounts that are not managed by an organization. They're not part of an enterprise tenant. And really, you don't want your users to be able to message and communicate outside or externally to folks that are not at least part of an organization, right? And if you've locked it down correctly, then you're only allowing your Team's users to collaborate with users in a domain that you trust. So you're not going to, there's no danger of them being contacted or communicating with users that are in some unmanaged state. And this is where, Koos, the example you mentioned of phishing, we've seen this play out, right? Where you have a scammer who just uses a free Teams account, finds out that you have Open Federation on your Teams, starts messaging your users on Teams, sending them links to stuff, and potentially sending them links to consent grants that then allow access into the environment. So this one is really one to pay attention to here. And this is done in the Teams Admin Center, where you basically disable what we call unmanaged Teams users. I think there's some settings in there still, and they'll probably start going away soon, but there's some settings in there about Skype users as well. Like you could, we've been able to do this for ages, where we disable Skype users from communicating to our Teams environment. I imagine now that Skype is officially dead, that will go away in time, but this is now for the next evolution of that, where you have these unmanaged Teams users. You don't want users to be able to communicate. There's another setting that is very similar, which is allowing Teams users or unmanaged users to actually initiate chats to your your Teams folks. Again, really bad idea to allow that. There should be no business specific scenario where that is something that you want to allow. It really is just a risky proposition.
Yeah, it's weird. How do you say that? Frustrating sometimes for the user experience. Obviously, as with all security measures, I think
Yeah,
it takes away a little bit of the ease of use, and people started applying their work in a certain way with these applications, and now we're locking things down, and we also need to explain to them why we're
yeah.
doing this, and they might get frustrated.
Yeah. Now the beauty about Teams is that it's such a great platform for development, right? You could build a workflow for these types of things where you could get users to
Yeah,
request that a specific email domain, or get added to the list, have that go to their manager for approval first before it hits IT, so that
yeah, yeah,
that users aren't just requesting their girlfriend be added to the whatever,
yeah.
or boyfriend or partner or what have you. So there's a lot that you can do here. But it really, from a strategy perspective, you want to just think this through and go, well, how much of a leakage problem is this if I'm just
Yeah.
allowing any unmanaged environment to be talking? So a lot of the things that I've talked about are specifically about, around, or at least the last three are very much about protecting data, your data within the organization from leaking out, right? And it's a big problem because of how open M365 is as a platform. But as we're seeing with compliance and all of these sort of governance and things like that, it's very risky for us to just allow our data to flow anywhere without actually having protections on who can get to it, right? And this is really the very basic first step of what you can do to protect your data from being shared by accident, or on purpose. Sometimes this stuff happens by accident, but really protect the data that you have. And then from here, you could obviously layer on Purview and all the other cool technologies that Microsoft have to protect it. But 5 things that you can do, and I would say should be doing to harden your M365 environment. No additional licensing required for any of these, so you can take a look at these today and jump in and think about how you can strict them. The steps are in the show notes.
Nice one, Chris. Nice summary. So these items, will these pop up? When you mentioned SIS earlier, will these pop up as a recommendation from something like posture management or Defender for Cloud recommendations, something like that? Do you know that, perhaps?
I don't know the answer to that.
No.
Yeah, because these are tenant specific in
Yeah,
M365.
that's true. Yeah.
That I'm not sure exactly. It's possible though that if you run something like Meister, if Meister is checking against the CIS benchmarks, that
Hmm.
it may call those out for you. Yeah.
Yeah, and I must admit, I'm also guilty of using these features as a user, because sometimes I was in a call with a third party vendor or supplier or whatever, and I had a follow-up question, and I just copy paste their email address in Teams and reach out over chat, and it's much easier than jump in a call and send them an email again. But yeah, I also understand why you probably want to avoid this. In my personal email account, which is not a corporate Entra tenant, but my email address is floating around for years, obviously, in all kinds of ways. And now I also see spammers requesting chat messages on my private email address in Teams as well. So they're
Mm.
really abusing it that way.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. And like I said, I don't think it's a case of where I mean, you are taking away having it be open, but if you do it correctly, in the scenario that you just described as well, where you have a vendor and you want to get back to if that was going to be something that was going to happen more than once, maybe you
Yeah,
had a Microsoft form or something internally where you could request, hey,
yeah,
like we're partnering with vendor XYZ.
yeah,
It's really helpful for us to be able to communicate with them via Teams. Can we add their domain? Because you know what I mean. And then at that point, you've got the convenience and the ease of use back, but you don't have that sort of openness, right? Which is
yeah,
what we're trying to avoid. So.
yeah. Sounds good. Well, yeah, like you said, these are just 5 tips, but I can imagine you can generate a list of much more tips than these 5. So we'll probably get back to some of these examples in later episodes.
Absolutely.
Yeah, SSR, Sentinel summary rules, or What was the acronym again? Like I mentioned earlier, I touched on auxiliary and basic logs earlier in episode 4. So Microsoft Sentinel as a product has perhaps a bad reputation being a expensive product, an expensive solution. And like I explained earlier, you pay for the amount of gigabytes you ingest in the product. And when people are starting using Sentinel as a SIEM as they were used to do in the old days, they'll probably want to attach all kinds of network appliances and all kinds of noisy logs sending out network traffic data as well. And then you can quite easily end up into the hundreds or even thousands of gigabytes a day. And then the cost will skyrocket as well. And Microsoft already took a nice step providing you with different table tiers. So you could create a basic or an auxiliary table for noisy logs, which are much cheaper. For example, the basic logs is about 1/8 of the price of a default analytics table, and auxiliary is about 1/40th of the price of an analytic table. So that's a real big difference. And even if larger enterprises have very high commitment tiers, so they commit upfront for a certain amount of data, they get a discount, right? And even with maximum discount, I think it's about 50% something off. It's still 1/20th of the price. So auxiliary logs is really cheap. But one of the downsides is when you store logs in auxiliary tables, you can look back the data for 30 days, and after 30 days, you can store it in an archive if you want. But one of the downsides of these cheaper storages is that you cannot trigger real-time security incidents on them. So within Sentinel, you can create analytic rules, and within an analytic rule, you put a KQL query in there, and if the results of that KQL query match certain conditions you set up in the analytic rule, then it will trigger a security incident, right? So, but with basic and auxiliary, you cannot use those logs in analytic rules. So you cannot trigger real-time security incidents from them. And well, that's why I mentioned Data Explorer earlier. So if you cannot trigger any incidents on them, you might as well store those logs outside of Sentinel for cheaper storage. And this was already a good idea before auxiliary logs came along. But even with auxiliary logs, you pay about 15 cents per gigabyte, give or take, depending on your region and currency and everything. With Data Explorer, you can even go lower. But the thing is that you have to maintain a Data Explorer cluster, and it might be a little bit daunting to set up at first. And there are also some downsides of splitting logs across multiple destinations if you want to find stuff, of course. So I think Microsoft is also acknowledging that, and they want people to stay in Sentinel or perhaps even move back. And well, this was a very long segue into the introduction and why I think summary rules is so useful. So what is a summary rule? A summary rule is well, like just like an analytic rule, you can create a summary rule in Sentinel, and it's sort of a scheduled KQL query in the same sense as an analytic rule is. So you can set up a time period for a couple of hours or days or multiple days, and that KQL query can query data in your basic and auxiliary tables, and the results of that query are actually stored in an analytic table, in a separate analytic table. And in the show notes, you'll find a simple diagram showing this. So the query is reaching out into the auxiliary table, let's say every hour, for example, and the results of that, an aggregated set of those results, is stored in an analytic table. What you can do from there is you can trigger an analytic rule triggering on the actual results of that summary rule if you want. So why would you use this? So example scenarios could be, let's say you have that firewall log, firewall sending those logs, those network traffic logs to Sentinel. And if you send all the traffic logs to an analytic table, you can look for threat intelligence indicators, for example, like IP addresses, domain names, file hashes, whatnot. But the downside is that you have to ingest all of those massive amounts of traffic logs. You see every allow and block and everything you see coming by just to pick out those TI matches, right? So now when you send those logs to an auxiliary table, you can create a summary rule, let's say, look every hour and distinct a list of all the unique source or destination IP addresses that's coming by. So you're already bringing down hundreds of thousands of logs down to much less rows actually, and storing only those IP addresses as a result in a new auxiliary table with the summary rules. And then with an analytic rule, you can look for TI matches on that new auxiliary table, that new analytics table containing all the unique IP addresses that came by through the firewall. This is one of the examples, of course. What you can also do with your security analysts are probably want to look up data and as part of the triage. So when they're investigating a security incident, they probably want to know maybe when an incident arises from the vendor for endpoint or the vendor for office, they want to know this IP address, this is an IP address, I want to know if this was seen by one of our firewalls, for example. If you have to sift through the network data, which is very noisy, queries might take long, they might exceed certain query limits because and have to sift through millions of rows to find a certain IP address. And again, if the analyst knows that we have an analytics table with only the results of an hourly summary rule distincting out all the unique IP addresses, they can look for it there and see when it was last seen, for example, and where.
It sounds
yeah.
like such an obvious feature,
Yeah.
right? But
Yeah.
okay, but I mean, I can definitely see how this would make a lot of sense, especially if you're trying to save on costs by not just ingesting and storing everything, right?
Yeah. Yeah, indeed. I think Microsoft is seeing when they started with Sentinel as a cloud native SIEM solution, what is it, 6 years ago or something? I think it's great that you don't have to pay upfront a certain amount as you need to do with something like Splunk or QRadar or ArcSight or something like that. You pay on the go, pay as you go, like with many cloud resources. But I think they underestimated the way SIEMs were used by customers. And well, customers still want their data when they move to Sentinel, for example, in the same way they were used to. And it also doesn't benefit Microsoft when people are migrating away from Sentinel, storing the data elsewhere in Blob or ADX or Data Lake or whatever. Also with their vision on AI, I think. So Security Copilot was not able to reach into data outside of Sentinel and Defender, for example. So this might also be a future thing to keep in mind. Yeah, and this is again, this is a great step in the right direction of increasing the usefulness of those cheaper storage tables. Because before this, I always said to a customer, you can use auxiliary logs if you have to keep the data somewhere, but remember all of the downsides with it. So if you just want to store it for the sake of storing it for compliance reasons, for example, that's fine. But finding anything in there, especially with auxiliary logs, because they're also a lot slower, and that's also why you pay 1/40 of the price. The usefulness goes down, and with summary rules, I think that's a great step.
I was going to say, you had mentioned before that as well. Customers they're expecting what they had before, but I think that the other challenge was for a lot of customers who this was their first step into the SIEM landscape, right? They'd never had one before, so it's really difficult to predict what your ingestion size and volume is going to be like at that point, right? So now I can see where you go.
Yeah, and I think Microsoft might want to warn people about it upfront a bit better, I guess, because when you look at the cloud architecture a reference documentation Microsoft put up. They update it every couple of months or every 6 months or something like that. So recently a new version of that was released, and Sentinel is there still shown as a security data lake, and you see all kinds of network vendors labels, logos pointing towards Sentinel. So Microsoft is really also advising you to do this, and it makes sense, of course, for TI matching, for correlation with all the other Defender stuff. So now Sentinel is part of Defender XDR in the security portal. When for example, a Palo Alto finds something suspicious about some kind of network traffic, and your user account or a certain IP address is attached to that alert, it also correlates with all the other Defender stuff. Defender for Office, Defender for Endpoint might also be seeing suspicious things around your account, and now those events can be correlated. So the usefulness is not up for debate, but costs was something that Sentinel became notorious about very quickly as well. And that is also why I want to still want to put some an exclamation mark on some things you still need to remember when it comes to cost and with summary rules. So a summary rule still has the same query limitation, timeout restraints, and stuff like that. So you can still not, for example, store millions of rows in an auxiliary table and then create a KQL query, very complex, which would probably take an hour to complete to get the results, and just dump that in a summary rule and expect proper results. The queries can still time out in that way. So you have to make your time frame shorter. Microsoft also reminds you when you create a summary rule and you do not include some kind of aggregator, so like summarize, for example, the summarize function in KQL, when you leave that out, you get an exclamation mark telling you that you probably want to summarize things, hence the name summary rules, of course, because otherwise you're just dumping the same result, a large data set, into a new table, and you're duplicating data, and that's probably not what you're after. And to keep an eye on that, when you create a summary rule, Microsoft also warns you to enable diagnostics on the summary rule. And this is a new diagnostic setting for log analytics, actually. So we all know the diagnostic settings in all kinds of Azure cloud resources. Now there's also a new checkbox for summary rules you can enable. And you're warned of this when you have not set this up before, when you create a new summary rule. And the results of summary rules is then stored into a log analytics or blob storage, of course. And I put in the show notes a KQL query where you can query the LA summary logs table, this log analytics summary rules results, where you can look for events which did not succeed or did not start properly, for example, because there were some issues. So something to keep an eye on. It's not set and forget. So keep an eye on those summary rules. Currently, you can only create up to 20 summary rules. I know customers already wanting more than those 20, especially when they have multiple different vendors, for example, like FortiAnalyzer, Palo Alto, Checkpoint, all kinds of different vendors. They have all different destination tables, so they probably need different parsers and different summary rules for those, because not everybody aligns them perfectly with the same column names, etc. So larger customers are already wanting more than 20, and I know from experience that when you request Microsoft to get more than 20 summary rules, you will get those. So they will make an exception. Right now you have to go through support requests to get that increased, but it's possible.
That's a good tip.
Yeah, and one thing that's a bit weird with the permission stuff. So as we know, Sentinel is built on log analytics, which is around much longer. When I see the RBAC permissions being applied to Sentinel, the security analysts normally get something like Sentinel incident responder role or something like that. Maybe even Sentinel contributor, so they can manipulate stuff on the Sentinel part, like watch lists, analytic rules, summary rules in this case. But like I mentioned, a summary rule is depending on a destination table to store its results. So as part of the creation of a summary rule, you provide a existing or a new a table where it can store the output. What's weird is to create a new table, you need at least to have log analytics contributor role on the workspace. So if you're a Sentinel contributor, you can technically create a summary rule, but if you want to point to a new table, it will fail because underwater the destination table gets created as well, and you get a failure. So also take this into account when you're using SIEM as a code deployments, which I'm really into. So when you have Sentinel as part of your infrastructure as code deployment, including the analytic rules, the watch lists, summary rules, you cannot just push out a summary rule in an ARM or a bicep template. You also need to create the matching destination table as well with the proper schema, which you're going to use to store the results in. So this was a very quick sum up of summary rules. I provided in the show notes a couple of examples and also links to Microsoft Learn page, but also there are a couple of Microsoft MVPs. Specifically want to reach out to Bert-Jan Pals. He's Dutch, of course, Chris. You know what they say about the security MVP.
That's right.
They're all Dutch. But he wrote a nice blog with also some example scenarios with some useful tips and tricks you can use. Yeah, so that was summary rules for today's episode.
That's awesome. I'll have you take a sip of water there, or what have you, because before you tell us about our community project for this month, which
I hope it wasn't too long of a monologue, Chris. Sorry for that.
No, it definitely wasn't. But hey, I figured you might want a quick drink before we jump into the community project.
Yeah,
that's
great.
MDE Automator.
Yeah, MDE Automator was created by a Microsoft MVP called Eric Menon. I always read it like, because I'm European, I read it like it's a French name. So I would say Eric Manon, but that's probably not the way how I should pronounce it because he's from the US. So Eric Menon created a very nice, elaborate toolkit for Defender for Endpoint. Part of that toolkit is a PowerShell module, which can help with all kinds of day-to-day tasks as a SOC analyst in the Microsoft space. So he has a lot of experience in the SecOps area, and he was frustrated with all kinds of daily actions he wanted to automate and run regularly. So he created this PowerShell module, MDE Automator. You can find it in the PowerShell gallery as well. Instructions are in the show notes again. And from there, for example, you could push profiles at multiple devices at once, or pull in investigation packages for devices, etc. And as part of the package, he also created some Azure functions, also built on PowerShell with the same module, to orchestrate and automate a lot of these steps, if you will. And I would definitely advise to check it out, and also give him a follow on LinkedIn. Because of his experience, he not only has some useful insights for incident response challenges, for SIEM and Microsoft security products in general, but his posts are also very enjoyable to read and also funny to read. He's an even bigger fan of the Big Lebowski, I guess, as I am, because he's always using references with Big Lebowski, and I think his profile picture is even a picture of Jeff Bridges as the dude. So, but he has some funny comments with some very useful insight. So definitely give him a follow and check out his project MDE Automator on GitHub.
This is very cool. I don't really do a lot of work in the sort of day-to-day or SecOps space, right? My work is a lot, especially with sort of something like MDE, is usually around the onboarding. But this is cool, and I really like the look of it as well. It's got a really, really cool interface. So
yeah,
very, very
yeah,
cool. Nice
and
one,
Microsoft
Eric.
has APIs for a lot of these stuff, like retrieving an investigation package from a device, or initiating a live response session to get into the command line on a destination device. But when you have a PowerShell module, it's so much easier. And I agree with Eric. I'm not a huge developer per se. I also like PowerShell modules over constructing my own HTTP requests with proper headers and authentication, etc. But Microsoft seems to be moving away a bit from PowerShell modules and letting you create your own stuff because they have the APIs in place, and they just say, well, go figure out the APIs. A little bit the same with a lot of graph operations, right?
Yeah, you're right. But yeah, hey, I love PowerShell, so it's always a good challenge. But this looks very, very cool. So yeah, thanks for bringing this one to everyone's attention. It's very cool.
Yeah, welcome. Yeah, and check it out.
So what's you've got Experts Live coming up soon, and I guess as we're recording this, it'll be next week. But we're not sure when the episode will actually land. It may actually be next week. So, but yeah, coming days, you'll be getting ready for your talk at Experts Live.
Yeah, June 3rd. I'm going to talk about Sentinel again. My session is called Getting the Most Bang for Your Logs. Sentinel tips you can't afford to miss. So you have to put a pun in your title nowadays to get
I've
noticed.
seen some of the movie posters you created for that, and so they're all very, very good. Very, very good. So
yeah, well, I like to put some pop culture references or something like that to stand out in a way, and I hope people memorize the stuff I talk about more easily. But yeah, a lot of Sentinel tips. Summary rules is also being demoed and explained in depth there and shown in depth. And I also have a lot of other practical tips on cost management, monitoring your costs, and making sure that you're getting notified whenever the costs rise or dip below a certain thresholds, for example. So yeah, that's June 3rd. Looking forward to that.
Very cool. And I'm sure you'll be able to share all that stuff once you've presented it all. So folks, just follow Koos, and I'm sure you'll see all the goodies. So good luck, Koos, with that. Hopefully it all goes well, and have a great time at the conference. Definitely look forward to catching up again for another episode in 3-4 weeks time, I guess.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your time.
Late recording due to my holiday, but we'll edit this one soon and get it up at the beginning of June, and we'll see each other and the listeners back in July again.
That's right. For
our 8th episode already, Chris. Time flies.
Time flies when you're having fun. As always, folks, thank you very much for listening. Please feel free to like and subscribe. That really does help us out a lot. Also, feel free to reach out to us if there's anything you really want to know about, or something you'd like us to cover on the show. Please do let us know, and we'll do our best to facilitate that for you.
Yes, please do that.
Until then, Koos, have a great weekend. We'll chat to you again, and everyone else, take care, and see you on the next one.
Thanks for listening, everybody. Bye-bye.